Paula from Australia. Welcome.
Oh, hi, Sherry. It's so wonderful to be with you today.
And I have to say, I feel an instant connection to you just based on our pre-conversation, and the work you're doing is so aligned with what I'm passionate about and what I see as a great deep need right now for women and men, but especially women, I think, as we're coming more into this mature feminine cycle of the earth, of the consciousness. So why don't you share a little bit about why you're so I know you had this journey with corporate. I talked to a lot of women who were in some kind of space where they were, I guess, just kind of going through the motions. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but they were feeling like this sort of despondency within and a spark kind of dying inside of themselves and knew they needed to pivot. And so I'm curious about your journey from being in that corporate space and now the work you're doing.
Beautiful. Thank you. And yeah, I have to just mirror that back to you because for me, frequency is everything. And when I came across you and the work that you've done so far and the podcast you've created and the women that you've interviewed and the men that you've interviewed so far, I was like, oh my gosh, look at how this has worked across the globe. And this has brought this beautiful woman into my life who I just see so much resonance with. And I was like, this is not, the mystery is just extraordinary. So yeah, I
Mm.
love the resonance, love the connection. So it's wonderful to be with you and feel all the good feelings. So thank you.
Mhm.
And yeah, I spent 15 years in corporate banking, working at a senior leadership level for the majority of that time, managing multi-jurisdictional teams across many different parts of the organization, managing a really large balance sheet. So I spent a large part of that career in a very exciting, expansive phase where, it was fast-paced, it was big, it was exciting numbers, there was big deals on the go, and there was a sense of community within the organization as well. I have to keep remembering and reminding myself and others that, ultimately these large institutions are made up of many people and people are fabulous. So, we sort of villainize sometimes these organizations, and in fact, they're made up of a lot of wonderful people. So I
Mm.
had wonderful family members there that I worked with for many, many years. Until I reached that stage of my journey where that internal knock from within me was getting louder and louder that this is not my path any longer, that I'm meant to be doing something differently. And, Maureen Murdoch's beautiful work, The Heroine's Journey, talks about that. The point on that boon of success when everything seems to be working on the external,
Mm.
that something starts knocking from internally saying there's another life for you. There's this life that you're living is calling to die. It's calling to be left behind. And there's a journey you need to go on to let this life die. And it's difficult. Deaths are difficult. They're painful. And there's a lot of letting go. And it could be quite messy in that process. But it's a
Mm.
necessary portal that you're being called to, given that you are a part of nature. And nature is constantly teaching us about the death and rebirth cycle. Every
Mm.
season, we see nature fully die and compost herself into the ground in order to be able to be reborn in the next cycle.
Mm.
And if I'd known that level of of elegance back then, it would have been super helpful. But I didn't. It was rather a downward spiral of messiness and confusion and discombobulation and lots of attachments to my old way of being and my old identity that was calling to die. And yet I didn't know how to let that die because I was terrified of something new not being born. I didn't trust in that journey, in that descent into that unknown place.
Mm.
Um, and, it was really through lots of clear intentions and lots of calling it in, please, can I be supported through this process? Please, can people be delivered? Please, can you help show me the way so that I can navigate this transition, this rite of passage from this life that I've been living for so long and that I've so institutionalized
Mm.
into a life that I'm being called to that I don't really know what that is. And that void is very scary. That mystery is very scary. So, bit by bit, the universe, the frequency attracts these things. So I did get, people did get delivered to me along the way, and I got shown a different way of being, and I got helped and supported through learning this ancient wisdom that is inherent in these rites of passage processes, in
Mm.
remembering what a rite of passage is. What is this transition from one stage of life to the next, and how do we do them well, because they are inevitable. And that's really how I found my way from that corporate world into the world that I am in now, which is self-created around supporting other people, specifically women, to transition from one stage of life to the next in a really healthy way, and to be supported to remember themselves as sovereign, as self-sourced women, connected to sisterhood in a healthy way, and really healing that deep feminine within them through the understanding that can come through practicing these types of rituals, ceremonies, and learning more about the journey of feminine consciousness and how to integrate that within ourselves on our masculine and feminine sides, in order for then us to be able to understand, this is how I need to give myself back out to the world in healthy, integrated service, as opposed to predisposed to my old way of being, which was hyper masculine, and then a bit loose on the feminine side without the healthy banks of the masculine, being able to
Yeah.
support that feminine to
That
express.
raging river of the feminine. So, wow, that is a lot. And that is a beautiful, um, rich description of where you found meaning, where you found purpose, which is very similar to myself and so many other women right now, finding just this dying ember inside where they might have I had a beautiful life. I had a lot of security and safety and safeguards and structure, and I was like, oh, like life is great for the most part. Everything's flowing, everything's nice. And I kind of have this theory that it is when you get that, I don't want to freak people out by saying this if they have a measure of comfort in their life right now. But if you're on the path of evolution, if you're, which your soul always is, let's be honest, and you probably wouldn't be on the planet right now or even listening to this episode if you were the kind of person who was not interested in evolution. But let's just say you had this measure of comfort, which I did. My theory is that the universe waits, your soul waits for that moment when you are feeling the most stabilized, the most in alignment, the most supported, really. And
Mm,
that does bring comfort.
mm,
But being comfortable is not necessarily the path of evolution. Um, but I think what we're striving for, the ultimate comfort, if you will, is coming home to yourself, not your exterior supports, not the places you've been paying homage to. Like you said, you were part of a beautiful institution, and there are beautiful institutions out there, and we need them. But they have a shadow aspect as well because they don't want sovereigns, right? They want the quote unquote check, clock in, clock out, group mentality, and to say yes to the path of liberation. It can be a threat to many institutions. So, yeah, it's when you're feeling a measure of, hey, things are good. And I think that was the global upset that we experienced in 2020. There was a measure of all is okay, all is good, it's good. Life is, whatever. I mean, there was always a lot of trauma and there was always a lot of unrest on the planet, but that COVID period of time actually put us into and catapulted us into the death cycle. If
yeah.
Would you not agree?
Absolutely. I'm 100% on the same page as you, and it resonates with me deeply what you're sharing. I think it was about in 2017, we were sponsoring one of our conferences, and the keynote speaker was a gentleman called Deng Adut. And he was a child soldier turned refugee turned human rights lawyer.
Mm.
And he was shot in the back from Africa, from a country in Africa, and brought to Australia. And he had then set up his life in Australia. And I was having an extraordinary conversation with him about his journey and privilege and all those sorts of things. And I said to him, like, what is your view on all this privilege that you see around in Australia? And you come from a place where you were put into child soldiering at a young age, you were shot in the back, like,
Mm.
how does that sit with you? And he said to me, which has stuck with me forever, which was, in Africa we have a saying, I'm South African myself, so I'm
Oh,
from the
okay.
continent of Africa. So I had a great resonance with him. But he said, in Africa, we have a saying that when your belly's full, you can go out and do the good work. So
Mm,
it resonates deeply that, once we've got to the stage where our lives have seemingly looking pretty well sought out, it's almost as though there's a conscious shock that comes in some way, shape, or form that wakes us up to our next level of evolution, our next level of becoming. And,
mhm.
our human consciousness is notoriously asleep when things are easy. We just keep carrying on with the
Yeah, we
way
go
things.
into autopilot in a way.
Exactly,
Nothing's
exactly.
challenging us, so it's just like, okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's really where the wisdom in rites of passage is so extraordinarily potent, because when we look at what the transitionary phase or the transition phase of a rite of passage is, and maybe for your listeners, I can just talk a little bit about those three stages of
Yes,
a rite.
please. Yes, please.
So, rites of passage was coined by a Belgian anthropologist back in 1908, Arnold van Gennep,
Mm,
and he had studied these indigenous cultures from around the world and recognized that they brought a certain degree of ritual and ceremony around key transition moments of their community members' lives. So, be that
mm,
moving from child into young adulthood, be that moving into a marriage or moving into a death ceremony, or anything that was marking a key transition moment, having a baby, would bring about ritual and ceremony, because these communities recognize that a rite of passage is not just for the individual that's going through that rite of passage or that transition. It's actually the whole community has the potential to be uplifted when that individual transitions through the stage of their change really well.
mm,
And if one
mm.
person doesn't transition well, it has a detrimental effect to the whole community. And so, in our modern day life, where community is something that's broken down or very distorted, we've forgotten how to bring back cohesive community in this way by practicing very healthy rites of passage. We may, for example, have a wedding that's beautiful, or have a funeral, but there's certain components of what makes that ceremony transformational that get missed in this modern day
Yeah.
that we have. And often, there's just, it's like a sprinkling of additional ingredients into the mix to move
Mhm.
something from being a transition to being something that has the potential to be transformational for the whole community.
I
And so,
love that emphasis that in interconnectivity with the community, that if we all kind of go together, right?
yeah.
It's no person left behind, because if one person is suffering, then the if people are really tuned in these sacred communities, they know this.
Oh,
Like you said,
totally.
that the ancients knew this. Like they don't leave anyone behind, because they all suffer to a degree if one person is out of alignment or not feeling that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's that deep resonance with that. And this is part of this reemergence of feminine consciousness. The feminine principle is this flower bed, this feeding of the flower bed of life, whereas, the masculine principle is the seed. And, when we recognize that the flower bed is the kind of glue between all these little plants and all these seeds that are growing within this experience that we're having of life, it's like everything's interconnected. Of course, one
Mhm.
person suffering the butterfly effect in one part of the world is going to have an impact. Obviously, our
Mhm.
capacity to access that has been vastly numbed out due to our constant evolution of consciousness, and where we've been, or where we've kind of numbed out collectively, and how we're emerging from that. But
Mhm.
this is a beautiful feminine principle, this move from hyper independence and unhealthy codependence into healthy interdependence, and
Mhm.
recognizing that ecocentric nature of feminine thought and that ecocentric nature of the feminine principles.
Mhm.
And I know that you're really familiar with this, but maybe for some of the listeners, when we talk about the feminine, we're not talking about women and men. We're talking about qualities and traits that are associated with feminine aspects of life, such as nature,
Yeah.
and Mother Nature being a highly feminine principle, and Grandfather Sun being a highly masculine principle. And so we're talking about these traits that are around us all the time, but not about men and women.
Mhm.
Men and women may have a predisposition for certain traits, And that's varied according to the individual and where they find themselves on that spectrum of masculine and feminine traits. But, for the listeners out there, I just want to be clear that we're talking about some very objective traits that
Sure.
are fitting within those camps. Yeah.
So with
Um,
these 3 stages, so is the first one the interdependence aspect or
Yeah, so the first stage, what Arnold van Gennep coined was that in order for a rite of passage to happen, the individual first needs to be separated from their normal environment. So separation needs to happen.
Mm,
That when we want to have a fully transformational experience, we want to take the wedding ceremony and have it somewhere else. We want to go and have the funeral somewhere else.
mm,
We want to do the rite of passage for the youth transitioning into young adulthood somewhere else. And of course, we can take these principles and apply them into us in our ordinary everyday life once we understand the wisdom of that. But for it to be truly transformational, that separation from the normal environment
yeah.
takes place and that container gets set up. And the reason why that happens is that when we set up a safe container around the process that's about to take place, the ritual, the ceremony that's going to take place, it creates the safety within that container, in that separate container, for the individuals within it to actually stretch into little corners of their self that they feel potentially unsafe. When
Mm,
we feel unsafe within ourselves, we contract into that unsafety, and that contraction then becomes stuck. And when we're stuck, we have no potential then to be in an expansive way of thought or in a transformational experience that we're having. So, to create a safe container within which the individual and community can stretch into corners of unsafety is the first stage of a healthy rite of passage.
mm,
And then we move into the next stage, which is transition or transformation. And
mm,
that consists of 4 parts. So stories, sitting in circle and storytelling, which has that opportunity to preserve lineage and create that opportunity to stay connected to history of that particular community and culture. We can tell stories from our own individual point of view, like this is what's happening for me, this is how I feel, and we have that opportunity to express ourselves. And then we also have the opportunity to share stories from myths and legends, which are extraordinarily powerful. And, for example, the myth of Inanna and her descent down into the underworld is
one
an
of my
incredible,
very favorite stories.
one of the best, so potent. There's so much built into the mythology and
Mhm,
into the sharing of myths that has the opportunity to access. People have so many entry points to that. So,
mm,
sitting in circle and telling our stories is all the way through the process of rites of passage. And then the next stage is the challenge or the ordeal. And this is what we were talking about earlier, is that there has to be some kind of challenge or ordeal in order for transformation to occur.
mm,
That, if we've got a caterpillar that's metamorphosing into a butterfly, it has to completely dissolve itself into caterpillar soup in order to reemerge. There's always, a child being born through the birth canal is going through a compression when it comes out into the world. It's transitioning
mhm,
from the womb into the world, and that compression can feel very challenging. It can be fraught with intensity. The mother and the child both together, and
mm.
the whoever else is witnessing. And yet, through that process, we have life, which is extraordinary. So, when we really start to recognize that, hey, every single rite of passage, every single transition is going to intrinsically hold a challenge or an ordeal, we're able to be with that with more grace and acceptance and not so much resistance.
I
We
love
can say,
that.
wow, we can really accept that. And so that challenge ordeal is the next stage. And then we move into the stage of visioning, where we have the receptivity in our brain, the liminal thinking in our brain after a challenging experience, to be able to vision into a new way of being, vision
Mm,
into a version of ourselves, vision into a collective vision for the community and how we want to be within that. Really connect to that part of ourselves that's trying to come through in
mhm,
this death rebirth cycle that a rite of passage is.
mm,
And then the last part of that transition phase is the honoring, or what we call the return ceremony, where the individual who's now gone through this challenging process and come out with new ideas for themselves gets returned back into the community, and they get honored for their willingness to go through their transition and for what they've achieved through that process. So the individual then can connect to their unique gifts and talents, and they can be recognized for their spirit. and
Mm,
who they are, and for all of that to be reflected back to them, when so often people in our worlds don't really even know what their beautiful talents and gifts are. It's like children most of the time just get told how naughty they are, or how bad they
yes,
are, or how dysfunctional they are, instead of being
so
told,
true.
hey, you're extraordinary, and I've noticed that you are this or you are that. Can get really
Right.
specific.
As I'm listening to you, I feel this measure of grief and just a little bit of like resigned sadness that we have really lost this in our culture. Like when we start to go into that dark night, when we start to transition, that there's an alchemical awakening, let's just say, happening within us, or something sparking where we're feeling that despondency, and we recognize that we've been in a comfort zone, and that we've been kind of in autopilot or in a rote way of doing life that that's often demonized. It's like you stepped out of our circle. You stepped out of our community. You're not doing it the way that we're doing it. You're these bad things are going to happen to you. Um I was raised in a religion where there was a lot of ritual and ceremony. But the and a lot of it was very beautiful, but where it started to feel a little out of alignment for me is that I was paying homage not to my own soul and my own connection to my creator, but to a system, to an institution, and making covenants to obey authority. And very much God and Jesus were linked to that
Mm,
authority. So coming out of that community meant turning my back on Jesus and God, of the one of my understanding and their understanding. So part of my awakening, and my whole sacred feminine awakening, was around, we're missing the feminine here in this space. And while there's a lot of ritual and ceremony that's actually very meaningful and layered, and can be, very metaphorical in many ways and symbolic of my inner journey, I'm still not seeing representation of shared feminine authority or leadership, or the wise woman or the crone, or this archetypal, woman in her power, who's this village oracle, if you will, and that made me very sad growing up to not see it. But when I started to come of age, and I mean by midlife, I was very much, I couldn't not honor that this is what I was sad about, if that makes sense. I had
totally,
to explore that. So
totally.
so just pausing here, and I love this whole, because it is the heroine's journey. And by the way, I did interview Maureen Murdoch on this podcast a few years ago. Love her with the heroine's journey. So why do you think that these rituals and ceremonies, I mean, we talk about patriarchy all day long, but why why do you think that these rituals and ceremonies have been demonized, that go against, let's just say, religious structures or the norms of society, the ways you do it in Australia, the ways you do it in America, these highly westernized, and you talk about privilege, I think there's a lot of links there, but have you met any resistance within yourself when you really wanted to narrow in on, like, okay, part of my path is teaching people how to go through these rites being the kind of root word, like ritual and rites kind of going together. What is the demonization about? Why have they been vilified in our society?
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful question, and there are so many different aspects of that. I mean, from my own personal experience, um, the the level of consciousness that we've been collectively at, and if I look back for me, for example, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, when I was sort of in the heart of my banking culture, was that, we've co-created this, and we've co-created patriarchy, we've co-created culture. And there's, blame to be pointed all over the show. And at the same time, there's also radical accountability that all of us can take in order to be a part of that change, as challenging as it might be to be a marginalized group or to be a minority group, to still feel the weight of patriarchy over us is very difficult as women or as people of color or marginalized groups. It's challenging, and it's also really challenging for the men that are in positions of power, because
Sure.
they are ruling from a place of fear. It's almost as though when we're climbing up the ladder to get to whatever top we think we need to get to, there is this determination to succeed. There's a determination to get to the top. And yet once we get to the top, the whole thing shifts. We then have to defend our position as opposed to try and continue expanding. There's a kind of pause, right? I'm at the top of this mountain and now I need to defend. So it becomes rooted in a place of fear. And in that fear, fear is such a contracted experience that we all go through that doesn't have the porousness or the possibility of us being able to be receptive to actually being free from that. The more fearful we become, the stronger our dominance becomes, the stronger our power becomes, the stronger our need to preserve what we have comes. We can see what's happening with Russia. I mean, that is just an extraordinary example of
That's
fear.
like late stage capitalism and toxic masculine patriarchy gone mad. We don't have leaders in our, industrialized nations in world dominating, let's just say Russia, China, America's they all want to dominate. We don't have leaders in those positions that are operating from wisdom,
Yeah,
true
totally.
wisdom.
Totally. It's coming from that deep-rooted fear of potential loss. And from that point of view, it's like, oh, wow, okay, so I can see all of that happening. And yet when I bring that mirror back into my own personal existence, really recognizing myself as a microcosm of everything that I'm witnessing around me, is what is actually happening inside of me that is mirroring something like that? How is it that I can really own my toxic masculinity, my internal patriarchy?
Internalized patriarchy. Yeah.
Yes, and
It's the
my
conversation we don't want to have because we want to put it all out there in flame and point. Yeah.
because it's so, it's so hard to be with the shame of actually being part of the problem, even
Mm.
from places like Russia, or as obvious. There are all of these little facets inside of all of us. And the work I did with Sarah Durham Wilson was all around hunt down the capitalist inside of you, hunt down the internalized patriarchy, hunt down the ableist, hunt down all of these parts inside of you first. Before, if it's being triggered on the outside, I always say, look for the wisdom in the trigger. If there's something that's causing a trigger or a contraction for me, there is a live wire within me that I haven't yet hunted down and brought into wholeness. And it's only really from that, that journey of that feminine willingness, that feminine principle of being willing to turn towards these dark corners, being willing to take radical responsibility for ourselves, being willing to deeply own our own part in it and sit with the shame.
So hard to see where you've been complicit to your own subordination and others, and to recognize that internal shadow. What have you noticed with the people you've worked with or yourself when that comes to light?
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement that it's a very challenging experience of the rite of passage of becoming and awakening to recognize where we have been human and unconscious, and myself included, that realization of my own, as you say, my complicity, my contribution through my own unconsciousness has many different emotions. There is the horror at first, realizing even if it's on the scale or spectrum of impact, my sort of contribution to that is vastly different to Vladimir Putin's. But there's still that recognition and that degree of ownership. And in order to get to that place of being able to really recognize that it's through the trigger that the glimmer occurs, that once we turn, the antidote to the pain is the pain itself. If we're pained by the patriarchy on the outside, or we're pained by something on the outside, the antidote to that is holding that pain of our own dear and holding it with compassion and recognizing that on the other side of that pain is actually the glimmer.
Hey everybody, pardon the interruption, but I'm so excited to tell you about the new Mind, Body, Soul membership that I'm launching alongside the podcast relaunch. My research and career has focused on depth psychology, emotional healing, mind body science, and how to heal from the inside out through your whole body, through your miraculous multisensory pathways. And accessing these sensory pathways is how you heal. So starting April 1st, we're going to dive into this monthly membership where I'm going to give soul-based monthly mental health hacks on the road to emotional mastery. You're going to get a journal. You're going to get a mindfulness mini class every month, guided meditation, anchoring and alignment practices, online group coaching, and lots more. And it's super affordable, $12 a month or $100 a year. So just go to cherieburton.com/mindbody-membership. That's cherieburton.com/mindbody-membership. All right. For YouTube listeners who our YouTube watchers, you see we're now wearing different outfits. It's because we were at this apex pinnacle point of saying some super cool stuff. Well, Paula was, and I was just riveted. And then, as fate would have it, we had some technical issues, but we're jumping right back in as if we're not missing a beat. And we were talking about this space of going into radical accountability for some of this internalized patriarchy and some of the messages that we've from our societal conditioning and how we've internalized it and made it our truth. And so anything, Paula, you want to continue to explore there is divine.
Yeah, beautiful, Sherry. Thank you so much. The question I have is, why is it so difficult to transition from this state of being that we are collectively in, which is highly contracted by nature? You know, we can look around us and see the number of people who are struggling with mental health, see the number of people who are struggling with their sense of marginalization. It's just evident, you know, the youth and how they're struggling to transition, the challenges we have around technology. There is a big collective contraction that we are all living through, and yet we don't necessarily know how to move from this place into the next.
Mhm.
And largely speaking, that is because we have not necessarily been taught yet in our culture, in our communities, in our education system, in our families, about how to actually turn towards the shadow parts of ourselves, these shadow aspects of self, these shadow aspects that are not only individual but collective on a grander scale.
Mhm.
We haven't been taught how to be with the challenging side of the spectrum of human emotions.
No, we've been taught
You know,
to
in today's
bypass.
bypass, yeah, it's like take the pill or drink it away or do whatever, you know, like
Mhm.
get yourself happy, do something you love, etc. Yes, all of those are options, and yet they're just masking the underlying challenge, which is that collectively over generations we have not actually been able in our emotional being to be able to turn towards these challenging parts of our human experience, which are an absolute inherent part of being human.
Mhm.
This full spectrum of emotion is why we're here. It's not just for the light, you know, fun, joyful, happy, blissful states. There is, in this dual world that we live in, there is this dark side of the emotional spectrum that is a very difficult experience to be with, or the mind will create a story that it is difficult to be with. As opposed to actually recognizing that it's only in our resistance to being with that challenging side of the emotional spectrum that we are actually in a contortion
Mm.
and in the challenge. And that's why this process of building our capacity individually and collectively to recognize that turning towards the difficult feelings and allowing ourselves to use the pain as the antidote to the pain.
Mm.
So really saying, wow, if I can turn towards these difficult feelings in a way that is healthy, and even though the mind is saying, I don't want to do this because it's difficult, it's challenging, we've touched earlier on in our interaction that every rite of passage involves a challenge or an ordeal.
Sure.
We can't transition from one stage of life to the next without actually embracing the fact that we have to go through some kind of compression, some kind of diamond forming compression, some kind of birth canal to move from one stage of life to the next,
Yeah.
some cocoon to metamorphose from the caterpillar into the butterfly. It's a necessary part of nature in our transition. And where we are right now, individually and collectively, is lacking our capacity to understand and embrace the fact that that is a necessary step, and that actually we are going to be okay if we consciously turn towards it. It's only in this resistance to it
Mm.
that we are suffering,
Yes.
and it's only in the resistance to it that it persists.
I have a great metaphor for that. And you did bring up birth and labor. My children that I birthed, I have two adopted children, but the four children that I birthed, um, well, the first one was a C-section. Three after that were normal births. Well, I mean, if there is such a thing. But I was never able to, for some reason, unforeseen, unknown to me until I kind of looked at it later, was never able to go into labor without induction or medical assistance. It's like I couldn't, there was some resistance there to, even though I wanted the baby so bad, I didn't want to be pregnant anymore. I wanted the baby out. There was some kind of way I wasn't letting my body work with the natural processes. So I had to have all of this medical intervention. Um, but it's like once the baby is actually ready to come, there is nothing you can do but surrender. No one had ever taught me that process. It was breathe, push, da da da, here's the intervention, but it was, in retrospect, I probably would have gone to natural birthing classes, but because I'd had a C-section the first time, it was just anyway. So point being, and speaking to how you so eloquently presented this, it's the resistance. It's the resistance to the dark, let's just say. It's the squeezing, it's the metamorphosing. Those are the portals of power and insight and wisdom. But because they're so masked, often in suffering or uncomfortable emotions, let's just say, we resist it because we're biologically programmed to run from pain. We would rather run from pain than run to pleasure any day because it's just such a squeeze. It's so uncomfortable. So when you're talking about having this radical accountability for something we've been subconsciously avoiding or in a resistance pattern with, let's just say, or sabotaging, even unaware, how do you climb in, for lack of a better phrase, to really come to like be able to sit with that tension or sit in the dark and examine those places that are uncomfortable and sit in them without feeling like, I guess we could say, feeling safe to do that, or without feeling like we're going to die, because that's the program. That's our ego saying, you're going to die. If you sit in this too long, you won't survive.
Yeah. It's such an interesting paradox, this whole experience of being
Yeah.
yet the mind cannot discern between the parts of ourselves that need to die and the parts of ourselves that we still wish to live. And so my counsel would be, and what I've witnessed, especially around the circles that I sit with, is that this reemergence of sitting in circle together and being able to support one another without needing to rescue or solve or save or fix or make it go away is one of the most potent medicines that's reemerging in our times today.
Mm.
Because we, in what you described there around this, lack of capacity that we have to be with our challenging experiences, to the resistance we have towards to going into the dark, that isn't just on a personal level that I'm resistant to my own dark. I also struggle to be able to turn towards my dark in community with others because other people's darkness is triggered by my darkness. So I'm not necessarily held in my family, or I'm not necessarily held in my workplace or my community to digest and express and share these difficult experiences that I'm having, because the minute I start going into a difficult conversation like that, all the energetics in the room start changing. People start closing up. There's like a kind of frigidness that comes to people. Oh my gosh, are we going to
Yeah.
talk about this really difficult thing? Like, how are we going to do that? So
Mhm.
collectively, we lack that capacity as well. And
Mhm.
so where does someone go? Like, where do I go?
Well,
I can't sit with
yeah, and just
myself.
to
I
put a
don't
little
want
bookmark
to.
there, like I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of times the family culture isn't supportive of opening up these discussions. I mean, definitely my family of origin was, we were very close and we talked about a lot, but it has only been until, the last 5 years that we really looked at some of our family patterns in detail. My older kids, I have 3 older kids, out of the house in their 20s, and it's the same thing. We're coming back and opening up that discussion. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. But you look also not only in family cultures, but religious cultures. There's a lot of bypassing that goes on because the programming I received is if something's coming up that's uncomfortable, it's because you've lost the spirit, or or,
Mm,
something you're being deceived by Satan, or anything that was uncomfortable or quote unquote of the dark in terms of uncomfortable emotions or something surfacing. It was always, you're not being spiritual enough. Double down on your spiritual practices, which is a form of bypassing. And I
mm,
see it happening in academia and in the government. It's just all over systemically. So,
mm.
with what you're saying is coming back into the private chambers of our own heart and mind and body and doing the work here first, not relying on the systems, not waiting for them to play catch up, not waiting for everyone in our family to make it safe or all the places in our communities that we go to. But it is so helpful when you have a like minded tribe that honors,
Yeah,
like you're saying, that transparency. That's huge, huge for women right now.
huge. Absolutely, and in that potency of the medicine of a circle of mature adults, and for the purpose of this conversation, I'll talk about mature women.
Mm,
There is such a transformational capacity to be held by the deep well of presence that maturity brings. And by maturity, I mean, it's not just a matter of growing older and therefore we're more mature. Sure, there's aspects of us that might mature, but when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about deep levels of emotional maturity come from sitting with people who have gone through their dark night of the soul, who have turned towards their challenging experiences in the dark corners of their lives and digested them through the challenging experience, or the mind created challenging experience of being in the contracted discomfort of the fear or the trauma or the grief or the sadness or whatever might be emerging for that person, to then be able to make come into sort of the lamb and the wolf lying down together, being able to bring that part of one's experience of being human into wholeness with tenderness and with love. And there's this reparenting process that we go through in that initiation into maturity,
mhm,
where we recognize that all those dark corners are really just fragmented parts of our own personal lived experience that happen for these beautiful younger versions of ourselves, these inner child parts or these maiden parts, these younger adult parts that didn't at that time have the maturity or the know-how or the education or the culture or the ability to digest a challenging experience that happened for us
mhm,
when we were 5, 7, 11, 13, 15, whatever age it might be. And so at that time, when that experience happened, that younger version of ourselves contracted around that experience, saying, I'm out of control. I don't know what to do. This is dangerous. Let me shut this down.
mm,
Now, let me never go there again. And every time, forevermore, an experience is coming on that's threatening to just unlock or touch upon that original wound, there is a huge amount of defense that younger egoic version of us has created to protect, with best meaning intentions, to protect us from ever having to feel that difficult experience again.
yeah.
But when we bring that maturity, that process and understanding of being able to recognize that if we are contracted in the moment in the difficult experience, all that's been called for is a part of us is beckoning for us to be able to say, hey, I actually need your help, even though I'm fighting you with anger, with rage,
Mm,
with, over controlling behavior. All these things that are emerging as unhealthy experiences in your present day moment are me actually trying to protect you. And actually, all I really need is to be seen
mm,
and to be felt, and for you to reach out to me and to love me back into wholeness.
mm,
And it's in that resistance of all those difficult experiences we're having of over controlling or anger or rage in our present day moment that's actually the problem. When we turn towards that little part of us that got contracted back when we were 5 or 7, and actually say, Mama's here, like I'm here now. I've
yeah.
got you, honey. Like, what do you need to share? Do you need to cry through my eyes because what happened back then was so sad and you never cried all the
Mm,
tears? Do you need to shout at somebody? Do you need to do something that can help you move the energy that's in you, that emotion, that energy that needs motion through your little system, using my body as my mature adult in this whole dialogue with ourselves, the sovereign experience of self-sourcedness that we can cultivate
mhm,
in this transition into maturity, that little being within us can just realize that, hey, someone's got me now.
Mm.
that I'm held, and let me feel and express. And as that emotion like melts and drips away like melting chocolate, that little version of ourselves can integrate back into wholeness, and we can arrive here and respond from the present moment again, and not react from that contracted childlike part that has been running the show.
Mm. That's so beautiful and so rich to think, just in your spiritual mind's eye, just seeing your younger self. And um, I have had a couple experiences in the last year, honestly, of younger parts of me, younger versions of me, one around age 4, one around age 17, 16, 17, that I had done what you said. I had closed a door. I had totally compartmentalized that from my psyche. And to revisit those younger versions of me and to hold her in safety and and with compassion is so powerful. Um, how do you personally create that safe container when we're talking about the mature feminine, which is such a peak interest of mine right now? What that means, I'd love your definition of it. It isn't necessarily that you're older; it could be just through having all these multiple life experiences over many decades, but it's just like taking like you're in the work. I no longer follow leaders or guides that haven't been through some kind of a dark, I mean, the dark night, like climbing into the shadow, doing the work, going into the inner realms, teaching others how to access that, because that's an initiatory piece of coming into spiritual maturity that is making its way into the consciousness now a little bit more in mass, but was absolutely unheard of when I was younger. It was like you do everything, if you want to be mature, you do everything you can to pick yourself up by the bootstraps, put on a happy, beautiful face, and move forward in that old masculine paradigm. So,
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
how do you personally create inner safety as you're looking at examining these shadows? And I know you work with people personally on this as well. Do you have a modality or a way of being with that? Let's just say somebody's gotten triggered and they are just in fight or flight, freeze, whatever, and they're having a hard time even establishing felt safety in that moment, much less going further into a shadow state. Let's just say.
Mm, mm,
How
mm.
have you seen what's been helpful for you as you've worked with yourself and others on that?
Yeah, beautiful. So, everything that you're describing is so, I'm so tuned to all of the things that you've shared around that old paradigm and how we were taught. And, it really was just like, oh, you want to mature, just acquire something more, get another degree, add something more to you because you're deficient still. So, you need to acquire more to be more, as opposed to this new experiential process, which is the journey of feminine consciousness, moving away from that masculine paradigm. And I know we've touched on this before in this talk, is that, again, when we're talking about masculine and feminine, we're not talking about men and women. We're talking about these archetypical traits that we all have on the spectrum of masculine and feminine traits that live within all men and live within all women. So this is accessible to all of us. Collectively, we've all been kind of disposed to this hyper masculine way of being because of the culture we've been growing up in. But the spectrum is shifting towards this feminine journey of consciousness, of being able to build our capacity to turn towards the challenging experiences, into the darkness, and not this pursuit of the light all the time. Just keep, ignoring, as you say, like buck up, honey, pick up your boots, acquire another degree, and then you'll be successful. It's like, no, we don't need to. It's actually, now it's a reversal. We're trying to remember ourselves in our true essence.
Mhm.
And how do we go about that? In the rites of passage process that I work with very, very deeply, is that, the sitting in circle and telling our stories in a consistent manner is a way of peeling back these layers slowly but surely, and titrating our way into our capacity building. Because all we're trying to do here is build our capacity to be able to be with the full spectrum of our human experience, not just this pursuit of the light, not just this acquisition of more. It's like, wow, we're trying to come into wholeness as human beings. So that capacity expansion is such an important part. But in order to do that capacity expansion, in order to create space within ourselves to be able to feel whole, we need to digest these experiences as they come. So sitting in circle and telling our stories is part of the process. If somebody's really deeply triggered, perhaps what's only available to them in that moment is sitting in the frequency of a circle environment and being able to reflectively listen to other people while they share their story, while the individual's having their difficult experience in their body, when their nervous system is triggered and signaling to them, hey, something's stuck here, something's stuck here. And we titrate. Feminine consciousness is not about this big bang approach, like, let's go on and get up there and just win it. It's like, no, let's go slowly.
I've been there and done that. I would say try to do that.
Yeah.
The burnout that
Yeah.
ensues is just not worth it.
And the frazzling of the nervous system that happens, off the back of that. We can go out for these peak experiences, which absolutely have paradigm shifting potential. We can go out for, a trip to Burning Man, or potentially on a plant medicine experience or something like that, that can totally shift our paradigm. And don't get me wrong, there's absolutely a place for that level of paradigm shift. However, our nervous system needs to be able to calibrate into that with a degree of understanding of what's needed for our beautiful systems to cope. And there's also a long integration that we can touch upon in a short while. That's an absolute necessity to support the paradigm to shift. If we just kind of crack open with a big masculine paradigm shifting event, and then we come back into our unfertile bed of our, rather unexplored feminine titration, the seasons, the cycles, the growing, the nurturance, the watering of a change, we're going to land up falling bang onto barren soil, and then everything becomes discombobulated. So for those individuals that are just turning towards this, finding a circle to sit in is a really great way of being pulled into the frequency of people opening up and cracking up their stories, and being able to just quietly listen and reflectively feel into one's own experience in relation to others, to be able to recognize where the nervous system is coiled. And what we do a lot in rites of passage as well is we use mythology as a, we've touched on mythology before, but, for this particular kind of descent journey, there's an extraordinary story around a Sumerian myth called Inanna's Descent. And it's all about her descent down to the goddess, to that her remembrance of who she is not discovered in the acquisition of something on the outside. It's
Through
not
going
in this,
down, 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 down.
exactly. It's down, down, down. And in that process, we're giving things up. We're giving up that internalized patriarchy because we're finding it and we're recognizing it and we're grappling with it, and then we're bringing it into wholeness. We're giving up those resistant parts of our inner child because we're finding her or him, and we're giving her or him what she needs, he or she needs, and being able to recognize that this part of ourselves is calling for some level of attention, and we understand in that journey of unfolding how to give ourselves to ourselves in that self-sourced way, in this ultimate descent all the way down into the bareness of the darkness of the underworld.
Where she hung on a meat hook for 3 days. I mean, that imagery is just like intense.
It's so intense. It's like therein lies the suffering. And yet through the pain, the antidote to the pain was the pain itself. Because when she came off those meat hooks, Inanna, there was a different level of being in her. She rose from the underworld, and I get goosebumps as I'm saying this. She rose from the underworld with this deep level of capacity and embodiment and understanding of the full spectrum of what it means to be a human being, including the dark. And with that came the potency from her to be able to come back out into the world and then hold this frequency within her, like that deep well of presence, that deep oak tree in the forest, this full spectrum of presence where others can then see themselves in the mirror that she is, feeling her frequency, recognizing that there is something deeply mature and present and awakened about her. And that's really what my encouragement would be, is that titrate one's way in, find a circle that you can sit in consistently and learn how to share yourself and unlock those little trapped parts. When you get that unlocked, then allow yourself to dive a little bit more deeply into things like the Sumerian mythology, into internal family systems and work these parts, into the archetypes and really learn how to do this, because ultimately we've all realized, us women now that we're in our midlife, that no prince is coming on his horse, even though that's what
No
we
one's
were
coming to
told.
save you, ladies.
No
No
one's
one's coming to
coming
save you.
out. Yeah, so
You
you
know
know
how
what, we
hard
need
that
to,
was for me? Like,
yeah, we have to do it for ourselves.
we
We have to jump on and
we
do
are
it
the
for
ones
ourselves.
we've been waiting for.
Yeah.
And that realization packs an incredible cosmic punch. Um, I can only speak for myself in, this descent journey, and I think you can go through a series of them, but I do believe that sometime during midlife, we are called to that. It's like, okay, well, the first half of your life, you have been capitulating to systems and ideas and idea. What do you want? What do you feel? What's true for you? What lives in your embodied space of reason or comfort or discomfort? And so you get to, for once, come into your own and really, really examine what you've been taught versus what you inherently already know. Like you said, remember, a lot of times remembering, it requires a dismembering, and we have to literally be torn apart, broken apart, hang on the meat hook, to use that underworld metaphor. I love what you're saying about circles, because I do have a women's wisdom circle that we're launching in 2024. We were going to do it this year, but I decided to put it off to deepen into my own work, and also the timing of, probably next spring. But and the research is really clear that women learn best through community. We are tribal, we are relational. It's not that men don't benefit from communities and small circles. I'm not saying that, but especially at this pivotal time in history, women need to galvanize with one another and validate and be vulnerable and have a safe space created so that they are able to, like you said, either be a witness, like a merciful witness to what's coming up for them when they see other people sharing, or to be given the floor, so to speak, or be put on the hot seat so that they can be witnessed. And there's something really, really beautiful about that container that promotes exponential growth for the feminine.
Oh, completely. Because there's this big piece as well, which maybe we can touch on for a moment, around the deep wound within the feminine and the deep wound amongst women.
Oh,
There is, as you've quite rightly said, there is this potency to women working together in a collaborative, community orientated way that is so unbelievably powerful. It's just extraordinary and next level. And yet we have such a deep feminine wound, which goes back, to the beginning of time, as women have been pitted against one another, the age of the witches, when, women had to give one another up, otherwise they were burned at the stake themselves. And it's just unbelievable how deep that wound within the feminine psyche is, and how many women are so distrustful or mistrustful of other women, and how unhealthy competition comes in. And, I again, in this whole discussion we've been having around how do we hunt this down within ourselves, and it really came to the forefront for me when I was leaving my corporate job. There was a wonderful woman who worked in another department who I had an enormous amount of respect for. And she wanted to shift into a role that had big people management exposure, which was my role. And so I kind of reached out to her and I said, I'm going to be transitioning out of the bank, and I'd love to talk to you about the potential for you to come in and take over from me and run the teams. And so we had some really good, healthy conversations, and it was all great. I'm like, yeah, women working together with women, this is so great. And then by chance, one day I was, walking past one of the meeting rooms, and I saw my boss in a meeting room with her. And the instantaneous stab of jealousy I got through my heart in that moment, feeling like I was getting usurped, and that she was going to be like, all of these thoughts went through at lightning speed. And I was like, wow, Paula, you've orchestrated this whole thing. You've chosen for her to take over because you respect her and you want your teams to be able to thrive. And look at this instantaneous reaction in your, that was so shocking for me. It was like, wow, you think you've got, you're not part of that experience of sisterhood wounding, and yet here it is. Thank you so much for the fodder within which I could chew on and go like, wow, let me just have a look at myself in that, So there is this necessity for us to really work out as women, and not even work out, remember as women how to come back into healthy relating with one another, and therefore to carry forward the communities that we need in this shifting time.
I love that. There's always the universe is always sending, it comes cloaked in many forms,
Curriculum.
but always teach, showing us and we can just trust that we're being brought to the next lesson for our evolution. It's usually in the most uncomfortable, and it's the people who trigger us most. And it's where our ego is getting chided or threatened, where we get to look, like you said, in a work environment, that and I'm noticing in marriage, I've been married 28 years, and there's just multiple layers to this, even though you think, you got one layer, check. Something else will come forward for you to look at and examine. It takes a great degree of humility just to sit with the uncomfortable, like, and not project and not blame. I want to come back to integration as we kind of wrap our discussion. 'Cause you had some it sounded like some juicy stuff to share with us around how we can integrate, let's just say, a very transcendental experience. Like I think I mentioned to you either on or off air, it's all blending together for me, that I did have such an experience in Costa Rica during a fourth night in a row of taking ayahuasca medicine at the third dose. It all kicked in at once, cumulatively from those other 3 or 4 nights in a row. And I literally, and I've done a whole podcast episode on this, but it was a time in my life where I was really, really wanting to get to the heart of what is driving this behavior. And some of it was judgmentalism, and just there was just a lot of uncomfortable things I was facing. My whole world paradigm was shifting. I was starting to wake up in big ways. And I had such a pronounced experience, kind of a kundalini type of, definitely a kundalini type of experience, but it went even deeper. It was like lots of visuals and symbolism and archetypes, and it's still something I'm integrating. And I think people have the perception that if you have those kinds of experiences, you're fixed, you're good, you woke up, you unplugged from the matrix, whatever. And it's only just putting you on the path, really, to go even deeper. But like I said, I'm still integrating it in the sense that the symbology has such rich and layered meaning for me personally, ancestrally and personally, and even in my communities. So, how have you seen integrate? Let's just talk about how what goes wrong when you don't integrate. Let's just say I took that experience and I was like, I'm not going to examine it anymore. It was really uncomfortable, parts of it. And so I'm just gonna, I don't understand it. So I don't want to dive too deep into it. Um,
Mm,
there's something called ontological shock. I'm not sure if you're aware of that
mm,
term, but if you do sometimes have some of these more pronounced experiences, it can actually put you into a state of shock or even PTSD if you're not psychologically robust enough to even. And I was bordering at that time on being ready or not, but I think that my system was ready, and so a lot came out. I should say my higher self really wanted that to happen. Um, anyway, so with
yeah.
integration, what are some ways that you have seen to fully come into your body and really examine some of those, I guess, more pronounced experiences and put them into your day to day walk through life? Because they can be cosmic, and we have these 3D bodies and this world around us. So it can be a challenge, especially if you're a mom.
Yeah, it can totally be a challenge. And yeah, just blessings on your journey there. I mean, it sounds, I mean, you're here to tell the tale. So, there sounds to me as though there was a real call from the higher self, recognizing that the great spirit that works through that medicine can indeed, take the envelope and shift it as far as it needs to go in order to create the crack or the opening
Yeah.
for the type of expansion that is actually available to somebody who has enough of a grounded sense of being, enough of an identified sense of ego, of self in 3D. I am Sherry, I am Paula, I am here. And even though for a period of time there was this big discombobulation, there is a role, I'd say, for people who have the capacity to play that part in, right, I'm actually going to stretch out into the real corners here. Whereas other people who don't necessarily have the level of foundational work that you've done over your lifetime and the amount of time investment you've put into the cultivation of your path with the practices and with what it is that you do every day, that other people don't necessarily have that grounded sense of being. And what I've observed with those spaces is that, the envelope only gets stretched a certain amount, not quite as cataclysmic as perhaps what you've experienced. And I've gone through a very similar experience as well, where it was just kind of like go, 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 until my nervous system really did kind of
Oh, I totally
tweak,
shorted out. I had a team of shamans
tweak,
around me trying to get me to
yeah,
breathe. Like it
back
was
together.
that
Yeah.
intense. Yeah.
Yeah, that, and there we have it. It's like, so fabulous that you were doing it in a certain setting
Mhm.
that had a skilled team of professionals and
Yes.
deep medicine men and women to support you. And, same for me at the end of that experience, the shaman that I've worked with primarily, he just said to me at the end, he gave me a bit of a slap down, really. I got a bit of a naughty little girl. He's like, right, Paula, now you don't need to shake the jar again. There was the sense in me that I was going to lose my connection to spirit or lose my connection to community if I didn't keep, diving deep into my shadow in that way. And it
Mm.
was like, no, you're not going to lose this. There's this, you need to just relax, So there was a definite call for me in that process to recognize that there was a necessity to up my practices around any peak experiences, that there was a volatility to trainings or peak experiences or whatever it might be that didn't land in a fertile bed in the aftermath. That,
Mm.
I can't leave a training on a Sunday and go straight into work on a Monday morning anymore. Like, and I used to do that back in the day when I was working in a fast-paced environment. It was like, come off the back of some kind of travel, training or peak experience or whatever it might be. And I don't have time. I've got children, I've got a family, I've got work, I've got no leave, I've got to prioritize these things, bang, straight off on the Sunday
Right.
into the Monday. And, all of that culminated then in the tweaking of that experience where my nervous system was like, no more. And I don't think I did anything for another year after that. So
Wow.
there's this real sense of tuning in and not necessarily waiting like we did, perhaps, for us to get to that point where we're tweaked,
Yeah.
is really being able to recognize that there are many different ways in which we can support ourselves pre and post any type of peak experience. When we run our leadership trainings here, our rites of passage leadership trainings, which are 3 days, we always say that this has been people open up to community. They realize how different things can be. They open up to masculine and feminine within themselves. All this stuff bubbles to the surface. They make connections with other people. It's magic. People are so brimming with joy and connection and that sense of belonging after 3 days. It's
Mm.
extraordinary. And we always say to them, we're like, yes, and now's actually when the work begins. Like this has been wonderful. Now's when the rubber hits the road.
Right.
So how do we kind of set up our community to receive us back in a way that's going to be congruent and integrate us back in? I made the mistake of coming back from my trainings or transformational experiences, coming back in with all of this news and all of this expansion. And, my husband had been holding the fort at home and looking after children and
Yeah.
cooking breakfast and tidying the house and, doing all of these mundane things. And here I come bursting back in with all of my joy. I've learned over time that actually, if I would like to integrate, if my experience is going to be integrated back into this family really well, let me come back in gently and slowly, and let me check in with him. How is he going? Let me see what the children need. Let me see if there's dinner I can cook or something that can then support him in a nourishing way, bring this beautiful, expansive energy that I've created over the course of however long I've been away, and bring it back in a way that then is filtering into my home environment in a very beautiful way so that he feels nourished and supported. And then in turn, I feel nourished and supported, and recognizing that interdependence between us and being able to be in that currency and that flow, making sure that I've got a circle set up for the group that I was away with. We always do a Zoom circle afterwards, potentially 2 or 3,
Mhm.
just checking in. How's everyone going? Like, let's just check in again. What's worked? What hasn't worked? What have you been able to do? What haven't you been able to do?
Yeah.
Upping my practices, walking out in nature, spending time just really absorbed into nature, letting go of that mind that's saying I need to do 100 things on my to-do list,
Mhm.
and taking the 45 minutes to just go out and sit next to a tree and breathe deeply
Yeah.
and let that process of integration take its time. We think, oh, I've integrated that experience. We've never fully integrated any experience. I'm still integrating birth. It's
Yeah.
like it's
How do
all
you even
happening
do
all at
that?
the
Yeah.
same time.
Yeah.
How do you even do that? It's an ever unfolding lotus of experience with the layers upon layers upon layers of the same thing in different experiential journeys for ourselves. So it's like, I feel we'll be integrating those peak experiences, and bless you for, going into that really dark place. It must have been a very difficult experience to pull the pieces back and together, and to let that jar that had been shaken settle, and for the sediment to drop. And potentially every now and again the jar gets shaken, but it's like, whoa, the nervous system says no, and just really tuning in. It's like a lesson of intimacy with ourselves, of getting to know ourselves, of really knowing what's going to nourish us, and really learning about what we need and what we don't need in the moment. So yeah,
Yeah.
integration is
And it
it's
just
a long,
goes back
a
to what
long
you're saying about resistance, because I remember some of the best piece of advice I got prior to going to do that. And it was at a medical facility where it is legal in Costa Rica with, like you said, experienced shamans. We had a medical team there. And, so I had done my research there, but one of the things they said is the worst thing you can do is tighten, constrict, and resist, because that with anything, but especially in that kind of a setting. And as I've been, you know, seeking and parsing out pieces of that and the symbology and the metaphors that came through and what I was shown, it's the same. It's like I can make meaning of that in a many different ways, but not now. Like, let's just put that away. Let's record it. Let's write it down. I don't know what it means right now for me, but I was shown this for a reason and it came up for a reason. And I don't want to, bypass that. So I'm just going to jot it down and I'll work through it. And I was seeing a therapist at the time and it was all great. I had all the support I needed, but like what we're really talking about here in our discussion is it's really not for the faint of heart. It's if you really, really want to be a force of good and to guide people and be a facilitator, if you want to be a light worker, whatever that means, a healer, then it is we are past the time on the earth where you can fake going through this process, the butterfly soup, if you will. We are beyond those are not going to be our next level leaders. They're not going to be the people that will really be equipped if they are faking it. And it's almost getting to the point where everyone's by necessity going through this dark night, even if they are in resistance, but it draws out a lot longer if you are in resistance. So I appreciate the discussion around whatever you can do to fortify yourself, to have the bravery to sit in the dark, really is what we're talking about, for as long as it takes for you to feel that radical self compassion, radical self accountability, looking at what you've internalized, as long as it takes. I think that our nervous systems are actually, and our body's intelligence systems are so adept at assessing readiness. So I tell people when like the onion layer, we all know that metaphor, but like, don't take it too personally or judge yourself when something surfaces that you thought you had quote unquote cleared in times past. It's just that your body has determined that you are now ready to take that even deeper and explore it even more and excavate more. And it's always for your highest good. And that's where we fall short of the trusting of that. So I'd like to end with that. How do you foster that trust? Because I've done a lot of work around examining this and parsing it out. And it really, to me, it comes down to, do I trust the process? Do I trust my body's intelligence? Do I trust my soul, my higher self, God, and however you define that this alchemical work, this process How can we foster more trust in that instead of, oh, because we've been conditioned to doubt ourselves right and left. So
Totally, totally. Yeah, I mean, the very first stage of that, I feel, is this process of listening to ourselves speak. When I see these circles open up, and especially on the circles where people are not familiar with sitting in circle, is that, and if I recall my first circle, I remember the facilitator was sitting, there were two facilitators. And after we'd done the meditation process, we were going through a sharing circle, and one of the facilitators had by mistake pulled out the cord of the laptop. And the song had just cut off like that in the middle, and there was like a kerfuffle. And it got back around to the front there, and it was on her share, and she was like, "Oh, I just felt really unhappy. Like I didn't feel like any space was made for me here, and I just didn't." And I was sitting there going, coming from a corporate environment where you never talk about that, you take that sort of thing out the room. You always
yeah.
hold this glass facade
Mhm.
of everything being perfect and all of us being perfectly aligned. And if you're the leader, you are the space holder, and you must be perfect, and not show your vulnerabilities or not be truthful. And I remember sitting there going like, oh my gosh, like, is she really saying this in front of everybody? Like, surely this is something that facilitators would take out the back and then, sort it out. And it was so alarming for me at that moment that somebody would speak their truth in the community of others.
Mm,
And there is this journey for all of us to building that safety for ourselves by learning how to unlock our voice,
mm,
our truth, and what's really going on for us. And there's a process we need to go through. It is an onion, it is a lotus unfolding, it is a titration of being able to sit in circle, tell our stories, and bit by bit realize, oh, wow, there are these things actually under there and under there. And every time we uncover one, as difficult as the mind might think it is for us to go there, once we do, all of us know what it's like. We feel relief
yeah.
when we've found something that we've been able to release the contraction around it, and we've had the big cry, or we've shared the story, or we've raged it out. It's like having, feeling ill and getting sick, and then afterwards going, oh my gosh, I feel so much better now. There's a
Yeah.
relief. It's a getting well process of
Mm,
eliminating in a conscious way, in an intentional way, bit by bit, all of these things that are stuck. And with that, as we release those, we start to build trust with ourselves. We start to realize that we are safe to feel, and we're safe to feel even the dark, difficult things, because once that energy and motion has moved through our body, in whichever form it's appearing, we feel that sense of relief, and we can breathe more deeply.
yeah.
And so it's that process of unlocking bit by bit. And obviously, we can go all the way down into the big, deep peak experiences. And that's something that can come. But as an entry point, it's all around building that capacity to learn how to feel by being willing to unlock these parts of ourselves, share our stories, and listen to ourselves speak. And
Mm,
in that process, challenge our narrative and be able to rewrite that story.
that's so perfect. Yeah, I feel like, when we talk about being stuck or feeling disempowered, um, it's easy to go, well, it's because of this thing out here. Only that thing out here is the invitation for you to look at. That's why it happened. And there's something about unlocking gratitude for showing us. And speaking of gratitude, I'm really grateful all the way from Australia that you have made this time for us today. Can you tell people, Paula, where to find you online?
Oh, beautiful, Sherry. Thank you so much for having me. I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. It's been so electric and so engaging. And yeah, very much appreciate you. And I'd love to hear from any of your listeners if they would like to reach out. And they can find me at my website, which is thefrequency.global. And the Insta handle will be the same, thefrequency.global. So it would be wonderful to connect with anybody who'd like to explore any of these concepts further.
Yes, and I know our journey together is not finished because I feel such a connection to you, and I love that we got to break this up into 2 parts, but yes, thank you. Thank you for your brilliance and what you brought to our conversation.
Oh, thank you, my dear. It's such a joy.